My name is Megan Walsh. I'm 26. And if there's one thing my family has drilled into me since I was old enough to understand, it's this: image comes first, truth comes last, and I'm always the one who ends up paying the price for keeping that balance. Growing up, I got used to the eye rolls, the sighs, the subtle digs that reminded me I wasn't measuring up to the polished picture they wanted to show the world. But that Sunday dinner in our Boston apartment changed everything. My brother's girlfriend, Hannah Cole, leaned back in her chair with that effortless confidence, looked straight at me, and delivered the line she'd clearly been rehearsing. "You're still unemployed, right?" She said it casually, like it was just harmless small talk. But the way she paused, the way her eyes sparkled with amusement, made it clear it was the punchline she'd saved for the perfect moment. The table exploded in laughter. My mother, Susan, laughed first quick and controlled, then turned to me with that familiar tight smile and said, sharp enough to cut, but quiet enough to stay polite, "Stop making the family look bad in front of Hannah's tech crowd." My father nodded in silent agreement. My brother Kevin grinned, like Hannah had just scored a point for the team, and for a split second, I felt the old instinct kick in: swallow it, stay quiet, don't ruin the evening. But something snapped. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet shift inside me. Because while Hannah kept talking, bragging about her startup, her Silicon Valley connections, her big private investor meetings, one detail slipped out that didn't line up. One small thing she never should have mentioned in front of me. I didn't react. I didn't interrupt. I let her finish, let them all enjoy the moment. I sat there calm on the outside while my mind started connecting pieces she didn't even know existed. And when those pieces finally fell into place, their laughter would turn to something else entirely. Before I dive in, what time is it where you are right now? Drop it in the comments. I'm genuinely curious to see how far this story will reach. The dinner took place on a quiet Sunday evening in our family's high-rise apartment overlooking Boston's Back Bay. I pulled into the underground garage, felt the familiar tightness settle in my chest as the elevator climbed to the 23rd floor, and stepped into the hallway where every door looked identical, polished, quiet, pretending nothing ever went wrong behind them. My mother opened the door before I could knock, her smile already in place, but not quite reaching her eyes. She glanced at her watch and said, "You're cutting it close again," as if those extra 3 minutes revealed some deeper character flaw. My father was already at the dining table sorting through mail without looking up, offering only a brief nod that acknowledged my arrival without welcoming it. I took my usual seat at the far end, the one that kept me slightly outside the circle. A few minutes later, Kevin walked in with Hannah Cole on his arm. The room changed instantly. My mother's posture straightened, her voice warmed, and she greeted Hannah like she'd been waiting all week for this moment. My father set the mail aside and actually smiled, genuine, not polite. Conversation flowed toward them immediately. Hannah moved with the kind of ease that came from knowing she was the center of attention, telling stories about her startup in crisp, confident sentences. She talked about securing big VC funding from Silicon Valley firms, late-night strategy sessions with private investors, how the company was on track to close another round soon. My parents hung on every word. Kevin watched her with open pride, nodding along as if her success reflected on him. The shift toward me happened gradually, the way it always did. Hannah turned in my direction, her tone light but pointed. "So Megan, how's the job search going? You're still between things, right?" She let the question hang just long enough for the implication to land. The table laughed, my mother first, then Kevin, even my father let out a low chuckle. The sound hit like it always did, familiar and stinging. My mother leaned forward slightly and added, "You're embarrassing us in front of Hannah's tech crowd. Try to keep up." Kevin jumped in lightly. "Come on, Mom, she's figuring it out." But the defense felt half-hearted, more for show than support. That's when I noticed it, the designer watch on Hannah's wrist, sleek and expensive, the kind that cost more than most people made in a month. It caught the light just right, almost too perfectly. Something about it felt off, too flashy for someone who claimed to be grinding in early-stage startup mode. I didn't say anything. I kept my face neutral, let the laughter fade around me. Inside, though, the question formed quietly. How many times have I swallowed this just to keep the peace? The answer came fast. Too many. And this time, for the first time, I wasn't sure I wanted to keep doing it. The rest of the meal passed in a blur of surface-level talk. Hannah steering the conversation back to her latest pitch deck, my parents asking eager follow-up questions, Kevin chiming in with supportive comments. I stayed mostly silent, picking at my food, observing the way the dynamic had shifted so effortlessly to exclude me. Every time Hannah laughed at one of her own jokes, my mother echoed it a beat later. Every time Kevin praised her ambition, my father murmured agreement. The pattern was clear. They had chosen their side long before I walked through the door. By the time dessert arrived, the air felt thick with unspoken rules. Stay small, don't disrupt, don't question the narrative. I excused myself early, claiming a headache, and slipped out to the elevator without anyone trying to stop me. As the doors closed, I caught one last glimpse of the table, Hannah still talking, my family still listening, the perfect picture intact. But something inside me had already begun to crack. I drove home through the quiet Boston streets, the city lights blurring past the window, and by the time I reached my apartment, the drained feeling had settled deep in my bones. Yet curiosity refused to fade. It clung tighter than the exhaustion, pulling me toward my laptop the moment I closed the door. I sat on the couch, still in my dinner clothes, and let the evening replay in my mind, focusing on the specifics Hannah had dropped about her role. Her description of leading cross-functional teams on product launches and handling direct investor relations didn't align with what I knew about early-stage startups. I opened Glassdoor and searched for similar positions at comparable companies. Typical responsibilities were narrower. User research, basic metrics, tracking, not the executive-level oversight she claimed. The mismatch was subtle but immediate, like a puzzle piece forced into the wrong spot. I moved to LinkedIn next, pulling up Hannah's profile. The endorsements stood out right away, dozens from people I didn't recognize, praising skills in venture scaling and strategic partnerships. But the names were scattered, many with sparse profiles themselves, some only connected through her. It felt curated, almost too neat, the kind of boost that looked impressive at first glance, but didn't hold up under scrutiny. I dug into the company she mentioned, checking public filings on sites like Open Corporation and SEC records for startups in her space. No mention of the initiatives she described, no press releases about those investor meetings, no team updates listing her contributions. The gaps widened with every tab I opened, small inconsistencies stacking until they formed something undeniable. A quick flash came back, the table erupting when she turned the conversation on me, the way my mother's eyes flicked away, as if my silence confirmed everything wrong with me. The memory stung, tying the emotional rawness directly to this logical thread. If her story didn't add up, why had they all accepted it so eagerly? The frustration built suddenly, a sharp spike in my chest. I nearly closed the laptop, tempted to let it go like every other time. But the thought stopped me cold. If I let this slide again, what kind of person does that make me? The question lingered, heavy and unavoidable, forcing me to keep scrolling, to dig one layer deeper. I bookmarked the pages, saved screenshots, and felt the shift inside me solidify, not anger yet, but a quiet determination that wouldn't let go. I cross-checked a few more sources, pulling up Crunchbase for funding rounds and company timelines, and the absence of any matching activity only sharpened the picture. Hannah had painted herself as a key player in a high-growth environment, yet the public record showed no trace of her influence. No announcements, no mentions in industry newsletters, nothing that backed up the casual confidence she'd displayed at the table. The contrast was stark. She spoke with the authority of someone deeply embedded, but the evidence trail was thin, almost non-existent. My pulse quickened as I realized this wasn't just exaggeration, it was construction. Piece by piece, the fragments were forming a clearer outline, one that made the evening's dismissal feel less personal and more calculated. I leaned back, staring at the screen, the glow illuminating the room in cold blue light. The drained sensation had lifted slightly, replaced by a focused clarity. I wasn't done yet. There were still threads to pull, connections to trace, and I knew exactly where to start next. The night stretched on, but for the first time in years, the silence in my apartment felt like opportunity instead of isolation. A quiet afternoon gave me the space I needed. I opened my messages and typed a short note to Austin Reed, a former colleague from a tech project 2 years back. Professional, no family drama mentioned, just a general ask about checking employment records and public filings for someone in startup space. He replied within the hour, asking for the name and company details without prying. I sent Hannah's info, keeping it neutral, and waited. Austin came back fast with a warning in his first message. This could be shady, like those FTC startup warnings I've seen, shell entities popping up with no real activity. He attached initial findings. Hannah Cole was linked to a registered LLC called Cole Ventures, filed in Delaware, but operating out of a virtual office address in a generic business center. No website existed, no staff directory, no contact page, nothing beyond the bare legal filing. The company had been active for 18 months, but showed zero public projects or announcements. He followed with partial info, first a screenshot of transaction summaries pulled from accessible business registries and linked accounts. Small deposits appeared irregularly over the past year, each around $5,000, coming from personal accounts tied to Midwest addresses, Illinois, Ohio, Indiana mostly. No corresponding invoices, no vendor contracts, no evidence of services rendered. The pattern looked like informal contributions rather than legitimate business income. Austin noted the amounts were consistent with personal investment rounds, but lacked any formal structure or SEC disclosure, which raised red flags for anyone familiar with compliant startups. I stared at the numbers on my screen, the ethical lines suddenly sharp in front of me. Am I crossing a line? The question hit hard. Digging into someone's private financial trail felt invasive, even if it was all public data. But then I remembered the table that night, the easy way my family had dismissed me to protect her image, how they'd chosen sides without hesitation. That image had crossed every line long before I opened my laptop. Resolve pushed back the hesitation. I messaged Austin to go deeper if he could, promising to keep his name out of anything that followed. He sent one more file before signing off a list of the sender accounts cross-referenced with basic public searches, showing some had histories of small investment disputes in local courts. Nothing conclusive yet, but enough to tighten the thread. The partial info sat there like bait, teasing the bigger picture still hidden. I saved everything in a secure folder on my phone, closed the screen, and felt the quiet determination lock in place. Whatever came next, I was ready to follow it through. The deposits weren't random, they clustered in patterns that suggested staged rounds, small enough to avoid federal scrutiny, but frequent enough to build something substantial over time. Austin's warning echoed in my head. FTC cases often started exactly like this, with promising pitches to everyday investors who never saw returns. I pulled up a quick search on recent enforcement actions, just to confirm, and the parallels jumped out. Virtual offices, personal transfers disguised as business complaints, buried in state small claims dockets. The more I looked, the clearer it became that Hannah hadn't just embellished her role. She'd built an entire facade around it. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment, weighing the next step. Asking Austin for more meant committing fully, no turning back. But backing off now felt like handing victory to the same dismissal I'd endured for years. I typed the request, hit send, and watched the message deliver. The afternoon light shifted across the room as I waited for his reply, the weight of what I was uncovering settling in, not as guilt, but as purpose. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about seeing what had been hidden in plain sight. Austin's next message arrived with another attachment, and I opened it without hesitation. Austin's next update arrived the following morning, a detailed spreadsheet he'd compiled overnight, showing the chronological flow of the deposits into Cole Ventures. The amounts started small, $2,000 here, $3,000 there, but steadily increased over months. then spiked sharply in the last quarter with several transfers hitting $8,000 each. The progression resembled staged fundraising rounds, the kind used to build momentum and lure in more participants, but without any corresponding business milestones to justify the escalation. I traced one of the larger sender accounts to a name in Chicago. A quick court records search revealed the individual had filed a small claims case last year against an unnamed entity for unreturned $5,000 invested in a private tech opportunity. The filing didn't name Hannah directly, but the description matched her pitch style too closely to ignore. The real twist came when Austin forwarded links to archived forum threads on investment discussion boards. Hannah had posted under an alias, Tech Growth Insider, promoting exclusive early access deals with promises of high returns and insider access. The posts were polished, full of buzzwords like scalable synergies and first mover advantage, but the replies told a different story, users complaining about delayed updates, unreturned principal, vague excuses. One thread from 6 months back had a user detailing how they'd wired $5,000 after a private call, only to get radio silence when asking for progress reports. The alias linked back through subtle profile details to Hannah's public social media, same phrasing patterns, same emoji usage and signatures. My heart started racing as the pieces clicked into place, sharp and undeniable. This wasn't careless exaggeration, it was deliberate fabrication layered carefully to look legitimate from the outside. Imagine Kevin's face if he knew the woman he planned to marry had built her entire persona on these quiet deceptions. Sometimes the truth hurts more when it's family. The thought landed heavy, not as anger, but as a cold recognition of how deeply the illusion had taken root. I leaned back from the screen, breathing steady despite the pulse pounding in my ears. The aha moment wasn't triumphant, it was clarifying, like fog lifting to reveal the full landscape. Hannah hadn't just talked a good game, she'd engineered one complete with props and scripts. I closed the spreadsheet, saved the forum screenshots, and felt the determination harden further. The pattern was no longer suspicion, it was evidence. I knew what I had to do next. The forum complaints weren't isolated. Several users mentioned follow-up calls where Hannah used the same confident tone she'd displayed at dinner, dropping names of supposed partners and timelines that never materialized. One poster even shared a screenshot of a contract template that looked suspiciously generic, missing key legal protections. The more threads I read, the more the operation revealed itself as a carefully maintained illusion, sustained by charm and selective silence. My mind raced through the implications. How many people had she convinced? How much had been lost? And how seamlessly she'd integrated it all into the life she presented to Kevin and my family. The realization settled in my gut like ice. This wasn't a one-off embellishment. It was a system. I stood up, paced the room once, then sat back down to organize the files into a clean timeline on my phone. Each entry added weight to the case, turning vague doubts into irrefutable connections. The spike in deposits aligned perfectly with spikes in forum activity, as if she ramped up recruitment when pressure mounted from earlier participants. The Chicago claim wasn't alone. A second search turned up another similar filing from Ohio, same amount, same vague entity description. The web widened, but the center remained Hannah. I exhaled slowly, the racing heart now steady with purpose. This evidence wasn't just about her, it was about the choice my family had made to believe her over me time after time. The next step felt inevitable. The wedding invitation arrived sooner than expected. A cream envelope with elegant gold lettering slipped into my mailbox on a crisp afternoon. Inside was a card announcing the ceremony at Central Park, the date set for early fall, the venue described as under the trees with the city skyline as backdrop. It felt formal, almost staged, the words, "Celebrating New Beginnings," printed in perfect script. I stared at it longer than necessary, not out of sentiment but calculating this was the moment where appearances would matter most to everyone involved. I submitted the RSVP online that same evening, marking attending without hesitation. It was the practical choice, the one that positioned me exactly where the evidence needed to surface. The family group chat stayed mostly silent after that. No excited follow-ups from my mother, no logistical questions from Kevin, just a single superficial text from the group a week later. Excited for the New York Park wedding dress code is chic. I read it, felt the familiar inner doubt spike like a quick jab. Did they really think a dress code would bridge the distance, and ignored it completely? No reply, no emoji, just silence on my end. The lack of outreach wasn't surprising. It fit the pattern they'd maintained since dinner, treating my presence as optional while centering everything around Hannah. I turned my attention to preparation. I opened the secure folder on my phone and began organizing everything, methodically, screenshots of the forum threads under the alias public filings, showing the virtual office registration dispute, summaries from court dockets, transaction timelines Austin had sent. I arranged them in chronological order, added annotations for clarity, dates, amounts, direct quotes from complaints, and created a simple PDF summary so the key points would display cleanly on my screen. Every file got a timestamp and source note to make the chain irrefutable. The process took hours, but it felt grounding, turning scattered discoveries into a coherent narrative that spoke for itself. Late one night, just days before the wedding, I ran one last check on the investment forums for any new activity. A fresh post caught my eye, another user venting about a tech growth contact who had promised returns after a $5,000 transfer, but vanished when follow-ups started. The details aligned too precisely, same phrasing in the initial pitch, same delay excuses. The post was only hours old, the frustration raw in the comments. My stomach tightened as anticipation heightened. This wasn't old evidence fading, it was active, ongoing proof. The pattern continued even as the wedding approached. I saved the thread, added it to the phone file, and felt the tension coil tighter. Everything was in place now, the timeline complete, the contradictions undeniable. I locked the phone, set it on the nightstand, and stared at the ceiling in the dark. The wedding was no longer just an event. It was the stage where the facade would finally crack open. The days leading up to it passed in a strange calm. I packed a simple outfit for the park, nothing flashy, just enough to blend in while carrying the weight of what was on my phone. The group chat buzzed once more with a reminder about parking and arrival time, but again I left it unanswered. Each ignored message felt like another layer of distance solidifying between us. I reviewed the files one final time on the train ride down to New York, zooming in on the most damning screenshots. The forum alias matched the small claims parallels, the escalating deposit pattern. The evidence didn't need embellishment. It stood on its own, cold and factual. As the city skyline came into view, anticipation shifted to steady focus. This wasn't about confrontation for its own sake anymore. It was about timing, about letting the truth emerge where it would be impossible to ignore. I stepped off the train, phone in my pocket, and walked toward Central Park with the quiet certainty that everything was about to change. The wedding morning arrived with a muted sky hanging low over Central Park, the festive decorations, white chairs in neat rows, floral arches framing the path, looking almost defiant against the gray. I drove up from the train station, parked near the entrance, and walked the winding path alone, the phone heavy in my pocket like an anchor. Guests moved in coordinated clusters, adjusting suits and smoothing dresses, their laughter light and scattered. The ceremony started on time. Kevin stood at the front in a sharp navy suit, smiling with the confidence of someone who believed everything was perfect. Hannah walked down the aisle in ivory lace, radiant, and composed, her hand steady on her father's arm. They exchanged vows, simple promises of partnership, and future slipped rings onto fingers, and the small crowd applauded warmly as they kissed. Everything unfolded smoothly, flawlessly, like a performance rehearsed to the last detail. The reception followed under a large tent nearby, tables filled with champagne flutes and light appetizers, conversations overlapping in the open air. I waited until the speeches ended and people began drifting toward the buffet line. Then I walked toward the newly married couple with steady steps, not hurried, not hesitant. Kevin saw me first and gave a surprised nod. Hannah turned, her smile still in place until she registered my expression. I stopped in front of them, pulled out my phone and opened the file to the first page, a clean summary screen with the most critical evidence visible. I held it out without a word. Hannah's face flushed instantly, color rising from her neck to her cheeks in a rush that betrayed her completely. Her voice cracked on the first excuse. "That's not... You don't understand," before trailing off as she scanned the screen, eyes darting over the timelines, the forum threads, the court filings laid out in sequence. The excuses crumbled one by one, each weaker and more frantic than the last, her hands trembling as she tried to push the phone away while simultaneously reaching for it again, as if she could somehow delete what was already there. Kevin stepped in, then pulling me aside a few feet from the crowd, his whisper urgent and low. "What are you doing? This is our day." His grip on my arm tightened for a second, but the evidence was undeniable. The timestamps, the escalating deposit patterns, the user complaints all glaring from the bright display he couldn't ignore. He glanced at the screen over my shoulder, his expression shifting from confusion to something colder, sharper, the realization hitting him like a delayed blow. Guests nearby started noticing the tension murmurs spreading through the nearby tables like ripples across still waterheads, turning conversations faltering mid-sentence. My mother approached first, her face shifting from irritation to visible alarm as she caught sight of the phone and Hannah's unraveling composure. My father followed close behind, his usual calm cracking into something raw and unsettled, his mouth opening then closing without a sound. The air in the park grew thick with unspoken questions, the festive mood fracturing under the weight of what was unfolding in real time. Hannah backed away a step, eyes wide, voice rising in fragments of denial that no longer held any conviction. "This is a misunderstanding, I can explain later," but the words dissolved into nothing as more guests drifted closer, drawn by the sudden shift in energy. Phones were discreetly lifted, the murmurs growing louder, turning into a low hum of speculation. I didn't raise my voice or create more scene than necessary. I simply let the evidence do the work, watching the polished facade unravel before the people who had built it with her. Kevin released my arm, stepping back toward Hannah, his face pale now, the confidence gone. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, a small gasp escaping as the full scope registered. The tension thickened until it felt almost tangible, pressing against every conversation, still trying to pretend nothing was happening. Hannah's breathing turned uneven, her perfect makeup unable to hide the panic flashing across her features. The moment stretched, suspended, the park's natural beauty suddenly irrelevant against the collapse happening under the tent. The silence after Hannah's unraveling was heavier than any shout could have been. My mother broke it first, her voice sharp and trembling. "You ruined the day, Megan. How could you do this to us?" My father stepped closer, his face tight with disappointment. "This is always about you, isn't it? Always making it about yourself." The words landed exactly as they always had. Predictable, rehearsed, stripped of any real weight now that the truth stood exposed between us. I didn't defend myself or argue back. There was nothing left to prove. I simply stepped away from the small cluster that had formed around us, walked past the rows of tables still holding half-eaten appetizers and untouched champagne flutes, and headed toward the park exit. No one followed. Not my parents, not Kevin, not even Hannah, who was too busy scrambling to salvage what remained of her composure as more guests whispered and stared, their phones discreetly capturing fragments of the collapse. Outside the tent, the muted sky had begun to clear slightly, and I reached my car without looking back. I placed the phone on the passenger seat, evidence now delivered, and drove off lighter than I'd felt in years. The weight I'd carried through every family gathering had finally lifted, not through victory, but through release. In the weeks that followed, the consequences unfolded quietly, but inevitably. Hannah lost key job connections almost overnight. Investors she'd networked with on LinkedIn began blocking her after the forum complaints resurfaced and spread through private groups. Her professional facade, so carefully maintained, crumbled under the scrutiny, leaving her scrambling for explanations that no longer convinced anyone. Kevin initiated annulment proceedings quickly. New York allows relatively fast dissolutions when fraud is involved, and the evidence made the case straightforward. He moved out of their shared apartment within a month, the marriage erased on paper, as if it had never happened, the ring returned, and the photos deleted. My family lost the social image they'd guarded so fiercely. Friends and extended relatives distanced themselves, invitations stopped arriving, and the perfect picture they'd projected for years cracked beyond repair. Looking back, the story reminds me of those viral Reddit revenge threads where truth surfaces when image finally cracks quiet, methodical, unstoppable. But this wasn't about revenge for its own sake. It was about reclaiming space for myself after years of shrinking to fit someone else's narrative. I started a freelance tech gig shortly after consulting on startup compliance and due diligence work that paid well, came without judgment, and let me set my own terms for the first time. No more family dinners, where my worth was measured against someone else's lies. The freedom felt real, earned through the simple act of refusing to stay small any longer. Spot toxic patterns, early value self over family image. Sometimes walking away is the strongest move you can make. I still think about that night in Boston sometimes. It changed everything for me. If any part of this hits close to home for you, I'd love to hear what it stirred up. I read every comment. Thank you all for taking the time to watch the video. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to leave a comment, sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any upcoming videos.